Joining me now on Waterloo Live is Beatrice de Graaf, NRWGC and Professor of Diplomatic History and Security Studies at the University of Utrecht. Beatrice, welcome. Give us a sense of what relations were like between the coalition powers prior to Napoleon's return in 1850. And how does his return from Elba change that?
Yes, that's a very good question. The relations were quite well. They had met since September 1814 at the Congress of Vienna. And in February 1814, they had almost concluded every point on the agenda, and most of them went home. And then on the 7th of March he returned, and Metternich heard about it and convened all the powers back again. And this was also the moment that the last dots on the I were placed, and only in June, then after the Battle of Waterloo, the final contract and the Treaty of Vienna was signed. But Napoleon coming back put a real pressure on the Allied forces to get their act together once more, and not just sign the treaties as a paper tiger, but also make them work for a longer period. So one could harbor the thought that hadn't Napoleon returned, that the Treaty of Vienna would have remained just that, a treaty on paper. But because he returned on the 7th of March, and then on the 25th of March, the powers under the guidance of Wellington, they concluded not just the Treaty of Vienna, but a treaty of mutual security. And this treaty made them promise each other to mobilize the forces once more for the 7th coalition, but also, and this is a marked difference from the 6th coalition, that they would remain an alliance up until the spirit of the Bonapartism would have completely removed from France. So it was not just a coalition for military warfare in war, it was also a coalition that would really enforce the Vienna Treaty with bayonets. And that's the novelty, and that's how the relations were between the Allied forces. So there's a lot at stake at that point, and they knew it.
It's often speculated that a victory for Napoleon in the Waterloo campaign might have made the Allies sue for peace. You've touched on this idea already, that there is meant to be this clause of kind of unity within the discussions and negotiations. So how realistic, therefore, is it that if Napoleon had won at Waterloo, the Prussians, for example, might have sued for peace?
Oh, that's quite a difficult question, because on the one hand, Napoleon had discussed peace, and the Prussians and most importantly the Austrians, Metternich, they had discussed possible separate peace treaties with Napoleon. The Austrians had hesitated for quite a long time, the Prussians and the Austrians, to join the last coalition, the 6th coalition. And then even after the Battle of Waterloo, Metternich visited Napoleon and discussed it before that, but also after that, and discussed with him in Dresden and other places as well, whether he could just stop and conclude a kind of a peace treaty. But that ended not well, not for Metternich, not for Napoleon. And Napoleon said, well, I'm just going to wipe you away, and I don't care about bloodshed. So the question is, had Napoleon won, he would probably have engaged in manipulations toward a peace treaty, but all the powers knew that he would not be serious really about it. He would overturn that peace treaty the moment he saw fit.
So how does Wellington change attitudes within the coalition powers when it comes to negotiating the Congress of Vienna? We talk a lot about Wellington sort of holding Blücher back, but we perhaps talk less about Wellington's personal role within the framing of the Congress into what and shaping it into what it becomes.
Yes, well, initially Wellington was the ambassador, but then when Napoleon returned, he became the supreme commander. And there was some hassle with, for example, the King of the Netherlands, who had to give over the reins of his military forces to Wellington, which he did after some hesitation. But everyone knew, Tsar Alexander, Metternich, all the others, they knew that Wellington was the victor of the day. He had been applauded and heralded at the salons of Vienna that way. So he was the one that then sat down, wrote to all the troops, wrote to all the forces, and, well, you know, his handiwork, his paperwork, all the letters that he wrote. I mean, no one is as diligent as you, Zach, in bringing together all those material for Waterloo, but perhaps Wellington also reaches you at the Crown, because he sent around so many notes and so many notitions and so many calculations, and almost single-handedly he pulled all those troops together, the Soviets, the Belgian troops, the Dutch troops, the German troops, and also Blücher and Gneisenau were quite hardy, and they were completely willing to submit to Wellington, which wasn't a done deal. So that they did that had to do with the fact that Wellington was the victor of the day. He was the military hero, so they wanted to work with him.
Yeah, it's certainly true that Wellington's work ethic is something that's really quite remarkable. If you've ever looked at the Wellington papers in Southampton University Library, it's very apparent that the man could write for years. It certainly takes years to read them, that's for sure. When it comes to Vienna, what was actually agreed in terms of a peace settlement? What's its sort of intention and its thrust? Is there a kind of a desire for retribution, or is this something that's much more balanced?
That's a good question. It's a bit of a leading question as well. I wholeheartedly agree with you. It's interesting that when the Congress of Vienna convened, at the beginning of September 1814, the French were still part of it. Talleyrand was there. And he was horrified when he knew about the return of Napoleon. And after the return of Napoleon, and after the whole of France and the admirals went Napoleon's way, then it was clear that France could not longer be part of the peace agreement. So after the Congress of Vienna, the peace settlement was worse for France. Still, as Metternich ensured, and as Metternich also implored the Prussians, this war cannot be a war of conquest. So the Prussians wanted retributions, that's for sure. After Waterloo, they even wanted to execute Napoleon. And when that was not possible, they wanted to loot, to pillorize, to take away, and they tried to do so. They rushed after Waterloo, they rushed to Paris to be there first and to get their share of the treasure. And when they weren't allowed to do so, then they really made quite a case of getting more land into their hands. So bits and chunks of French territory that they wanted to incorporate into the Prussian kingdom, or another Prussian and other German states. But then Metternich said this war cannot be a war of conquest. Tsar Alexander also agreed with Metternich, because they felt if we do that, if we make the French pay with land, then we have another war in perhaps a couple of months or years. So, and then Wellington comes in play, and then there's this whole negotiations, but that didn't take place in Vienna. I know that you want to talk about Vienna, but let me bring it back to Paris then after that. So Vienna was in June, and in Vienna they agreed that they would carve up Europe, yes, and they would bring pieces of France back into the Allied fold, yet they wouldn't go any further, but there had to be some additional retribution on top of what was agreed in Vienna. So Vienna was the map of Europe, was the constitutions, was the rights for minorities, even rights for Jews, so more constitutional agreements, but what to do with France was more decided upon in Paris from July 1815 onwards, so after Vienna. So you could say that Paris was the follow-up of Vienna, and that's where they operationalized and translated the Vienna treaty work into more practical arrangements. And the retribution was a very clever act that they negotiated together, and it was a kind of a balance. So the novelty of it was that the French had to pay, and they were made to pay because there would be an allied army that would remain 1.5 million troops and then return to 150,000 for the coming 5 or even 7 years. In the end, it was a bit shorter, but nevertheless, they would stay in place and occupy 2/3 of France, and later on a smaller piece, and they would enforce France to pay. And France would not pay with land, but with money. And France would also invest in the creation of the Boulevard de l'Europe, the bulwark of Europe, a series of fortresses along the northern frontier, the eastern frontier, to Prussia and even down to Italy. And that was kind of a masterstroke. It would be a collective security system that France would be made to pay for itself, but the Allied forces would take part in it as well. So the Dutch had to pay, the Prussians and the British also furnished some monies. So you could say that the countries of Europe created a balance of peace by means of fortresses, stone, by means of bayonets, the Allied army, and by means of paperwork, the treaties, over France, against France, but also to some extent with France. And there were no war tribunals. The only thing that happened was that King Louis returned after 1815. He took the liberty and put some of the traitors, as he called them, for the squadron, the firing squad. And that was, for example, Marshal Ney. Very tragic story. So apart from that, there was no real retribution.
Yeah, as you say, Ney's story is a very tragic one. You talked there about fortifications. I wonder if we can just very quickly talk about the Wellington Barrier, as it's sometimes termed. And I know some of your research has found that whilst some of these fortifications might have looked quite impressive on paper, the reality was perhaps a little less so.
Yes. Well, the thing is, it was impressive in terms of numbers. There were almost 19-20 cities that were fortified from, let's say how to put it, from the North Sea coast, Ostende, via Dendermonde, Ghent, Doornik, Charleroi, Namen, Marienburg, Bouillon, up until Frankfurt am Main, you could even say. So it was quite a lengthy series of fortresses. Millions of francs were put into the construction of them. And on the one hand, they were quite impressive, and it took 20 years almost to complete them. But if you had a closer look, already Wellington himself doubted the effectiveness of barriers in the age of huge artillery, heavy artillery, very flexible force movements, maneuvers. So what was the value, the worth of the fortresses? And well, I'm making the case that their value was more in terms of the political cohesion between the Seventh Coalition, the Quadruple Alliance, because they all had to invest in the fortresses, including the French, and there were even European bonds issued to pay for them. So it really brought the countries of Europe together in this investment in the fortresses. But in terms of military effectiveness, Wellington himself said, well, they're already quite obsolete. And the Dutch, the brother of King William II, who was in charge of the fortresses, said, well, all that masonry, all those stonework, what does it really bring us? And in my research, I also came across quite some instances of fraud. Well, the Belgians were incorporated in the Netherlands weren't very happy with the Dutch from the north dictating them how to build the fortresses. So they sold improper materials. They filled the fortresses with sand instead of brickwork. So some of them even came down and crumbled while the king of the Netherlands was visiting the fortresses, and Wellington heard about it, and it was a huge investigation. So there were quite some flaws in the creation of the Wellington Barrier. Still, in terms of political cohesion, in terms of the founding element of this Quadruple Alliance, I think they were quite effective.
So overall, how effective would you say Vienna is at establishing a lasting peace in Europe?
Quite effective. I know that it's contested and there's quite a debate, and participated in that myself, but Vienna was effective only if you couple it with the Paris treaties of November 1815. Without them, so you could say that the return of Napoleon really translated the treaty work of Vienna into real practices. Without Napoleon's return, it probably wouldn't have been that effective.
That's sadly all we've got time for, but Beatrice de Graaf, Professor of Diplomatic History and Security Studies at Utrecht University, thank you for joining me here on Waterloo Live.
You're very welcome. Thank you, Zach.